The Shadow Man Who Watches. This is my story. A story that started as a playful friend my parents and myself boiled to an imaginary one, but in years to come would prove otherwise. I will try my best to recount it to the best of my ability, but as each year passes, this becomes a distant memory, all but those last terrifying nights that are still very alive when I close my eyes at night. I don't remember when or how I met this friend. Maybe it was in the 100-year-old home I got to live in for a short period before my parents abruptly moved away due to odd happenings in the home that began to drive my mother insane, a home that still stands now. Upon arrival, this home offered an attic and basement full of toys, more toys than any modest child could hope to have, newer and old toys alike. Being a child in a hardened family of 8 kids, I suddenly had it all at the age of 7. We never asked why the old home was so filled with toys, but my father said to not look a gift horse in the mouth. I don't remember much from that home, but my father and now estranged mother have vivid memories of the doors opening, closing, the sound of children's laughter up and down the halls, and the voices of a man and a woman who would talk happily in the dead of night. When we left, I don't recall ever taking any toy with me, but it is my earliest memory of when I started to play with my imaginary friend. For many years after it followed, I adored him. I never felt alone, not one moment. At first I couldn't see him, I only felt him. I would talk openly to the air as if someone was listening. My parents were convinced, and I too, that this was childish play. Yet it felt right, more right than when I spoke to my dolls. I adored him until that night at the age of 12, when I went to sleep and had a terrible dream. A tall, thin, shadowy figure standing and watching from far away, watching me until I ran for fear of my life, and it followed. I couldn't escape. I woke and refused to go to school for 3 days or leave my bed. The dreams would not end. Every night I would always fall at the end of it. Fall and he would be there at the bottom watching. I boiled it down to hardships of my family during the divorce. I later moved into a home with my grandparents. It was there that the worst began. After the divorce, I became a shell of the child I was before. I escaped to the internet on a computer in the corner of the living room, where I would play well into the early hours of morning. It started as a shift in the corner of my eye starting around 3 a.m., the time it would show itself each night. Something would draw my attention to the opening into the kitchen, where only a few short steps was the garage door. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand. I would feel a sudden sense of fear, panic, a need to run and hide. I shook this off as a silly fear of the dark. I would try to ignore it and look back to my screen, but still something would shift, and I would look again, no matter how I tried to ignore it. Time passed and I continued to ignore it. It seemed to invite it even more. Eventually that shift was a full movement. I could make out a head, shoulders, torso, arms from my peripheral vision, but never a face. It would seem to sneak carefully out from behind the wall, first its head poking out and watching, and then it would step out into the doorway. At this point, I came to the solemn conclusion that I was simply insane. I decided to accept this with dignity and not run around appearing crazy to my family, talking of shadows and bumps in the night. I let it continue. As it got bolder, it would walk from the doorway closer to me, and I would stare at the computer screen and dismiss it, continuing chatting with people online. One night it came so close, my vision became enveloped in darkness, and when I blinked my eyes open, I was standing in the doorway, watching myself on the computer, exactly where it stood. I began to panic. I reached for me, and when I came back to, 5 minutes had passed, and I had a full conversation undisturbed with the individual I was talking to online. He said nothing seemed weird about me, and I had to reread our conversation. Nothing was off about what I had written. Now convinced I was entirely insane, I hid further into myself. My father, who now resided with us, and grandparents became increasingly worried. I was ashamed of my apparent insanity. Then that faithful night came. Instead of me sitting in the living room at 3 a.m., I was in the shower, and my father was in the living room playing a game on the TV. When I came out of the shower, I saw my dad staring at the screen. He was as pale as a ghost, and his eyes were rounded in fear. I asked him what was wrong, and in a shaken voice, he explained that a man had walked out from behind the wall from the garage, and in response my dad had jumped up and chased the man into the garage with chopsticks, with intent to threaten the life of the intruder. But when he followed it into the garage, there was nothing. Doors locked, everything sealed, just a sickening feeling as he stood in the empty room. I was beginning to cry now, as I asked him to describe what it looked like. He proceeded to explain a tall, thin man with no face to be seen, peeking out from the opening and stepping out. Suddenly I wasn't insane, but this was far worse than insanity. This shadow wasn't the creation of a demented mind dropping into delusions, but a very real occurrence that others could see and hear. It was more real than ever, and I never felt more fear in my life. I immediately moved all of my stuff from the living room to the farthest room in the house from that garage door, and decided I would hide there henceforth. I thought it wouldn't go that far. I thought I was safe if all the lights were on. I thought it would be okay if I had others in the room with me. I was wrong. That next night, it's as if moving my stuff brought it further in. Right on time, just before 3 a.m., I heard the creaking of the floorboards down the hallway from me. It was so heavy, creaking slowly, as if attempting to be quiet, but failing as it drew near to my door, left ajar. Only my grandfather could make the floorboards creak as heavily as that, and he was a 230 pounds plus man. Hearing the familiar sound, I called out with a smile to him. The creaking came to a dead stop. I laughed, thinking I caught the old man. I stood from my chair ready to greet him when the creaking turned, and I listened as the floorboards slammed loudly with the sound of someone or something running to the back of the house. It ran so fast I knew it couldn't be my grandfather, who could barely walk without losing his breath. In fact, the speed was almost inhuman. Then I heard the familiar sound of the garage door opening and closing. Hesitant, I called out louder for my grandmother, a woman who could run if she wanted to. In my delusion, I somehow convinced myself she is a possibility. I don't know what came over me, but I left the comfort of my room and walked into the dark hallway. I followed with a blind sense of security that I was following my grandmother. I walked with such confidence that it wasn't even me. I walked into the living room, into the doorway where I stopped in front of the garage door, and my blood turned to ice. I turned to look behind me out the window of the living room to see that my grandparents' car was gone, as they always left around 2:20 a.m. for their early shift at the hospital. They were not home. Everyone was asleep. When I looked back at the garage door, the door that I locked shortly before hiding in my room was ajar an inch, and still the locking mechanism was engaged. I stared into the darkness and stepped closer. Every hair on my body was on end and every part of me screamed to run, and for the first time since I was far younger, I spoke to it. I said in a shaky voice, "I don't know who you are or what you are, but you are scaring me. Please go away." I shut the door and walked back to the room where I stayed awake the rest of the night. Nothing would happen for many months. I thought it was gone, and for the first time, I felt alone. Later, in a new home only 6 months after this happened, the feeling of being alone became overwhelming, and before laying to sleep I asked for it to come back. I convinced myself it must have been a friend I scared off, that it was simply its mystery scaring me, and if I gave it a second chance I could understand it. I woke in the middle of that night, unable to move, petrified, an unbearable weight of fear as I repeated with desperation to myself, "I take it back. Go away. I take it back. Go away," again and again, until I blacked out. The next morning I woke with an enormous, dark, oddly shaped bruise on my leg. A crescent moon with a dot centered by it. That bruise never went away, though it has faded since then. That spot on my leg is still a slight shade darker than the surrounding area. Since then, my life has been overall normal, though I can't dismiss the occasional odd occurrence. From a shadow walking across the lawn in broad daylight, to the sound of a screeching howl in my home a few feet from me, while my 2 dogs rested at my feet. Those were only brief and did not shake me, not like the thing that followed me through most of my formative years. I don't know what that was, I don't try to know. Ghosts, aliens, spirits, demons, temporary insanity, the list goes on. All I know is that it happened and I miss it, as scared as I am of it. I would also like to add, if anyone has had similar experiences to this, I would like to reach them. This has been something that has haunted my thoughts, and a part of me can't rest until I know. I plan to revisit these two homes between the hours of 4 a.m. in a month or two. I don't know what this will bring, maybe nothing, maybe more than I'm prepared for, but I have to know. Have